Hello, and welcome to the third part and final part of psychoanalytical literary criticism. In the last lecture, we looked at some chief Lacan psychoanalytical principles and concepts and terms, and we understood how Lacan makes a distinction between the imaginary and the symbolic. Lacan's stages might be compared to the psychoanalytical stages, psychosexual stages of development that we have delineated by Sigmund Freud himself. He looked at how a child enters the world of language, the world of the symbolic, and how that is in opposition to the world of the imaginary, while the symbolic represented by order and chaos and rules and associated with the father figure, the imaginary is more of a chaotic entity which has strong resonances with the maternal. Therefore, like we mentioned in the last class, the child now enters what Lacan calls the world of the symbolic. This distinction between the symbolic and the imaginary has been used extensively in literary studies by followers of Lacanian psychoanalysis. So as you mentioned, figures like Sigmund Freud and Carl Gustav Jung, Jacques Lacan, we must now be in a position to understand how they borrow from each other and how they develop each other's ideas and how they all significantly differ from each other, of course. Lacanian critics also pay close attention to the unconscious and the motives and the feelings. Moreover, instead of excavating for the motives that might be driving the characters or even the author himself, as a Freudian critic would do, a Lacanian critic would in fact search for those of the text itself. They are interested in uncovering contradictory undercuts of meaning that exist within the text, which is something like the unconscious itself, which like subconscious beneath the conscious of the text. This is, as you can see, perhaps another way of finding defining the post-structural process of reconstruction itself, which we'll be looking at in the next lesson. Now, Lacanian critics also see the literary text as a site where enactment, the demonstration of Lacanian views about language and unconscious play out. They are particularly interested in the elusiveness of the signified, as we explained in the previous lecture with the example of the tree. The perpetual addition of the signified under the signifier. They are also interested in establishing thus the centrality of the unconscious, which in other terms, the Lacan own terms, is structured like language. Now, to illustrate some of the concerns of Lacanian approach on literature, we shall now attempt a psychoanalytic Lacanian reading of a prominent text, just the same way as we attempted a Freudian reading of Shakespeare's Hamlet. The text that we shall now take into consideration for our appreciation and analysis is Lacan's well-known interpretation of a detective story written by Edgar Allan Poe, and the story is called The Pearl-Noid Letter. Now, as of the case of Hamlet, I will briefly run you through the basic premise and the plot of the story, and we will then attempt psychoanalytical Lacanian reading of the very same. Now, there are 5 characters in this story. There is a queen, there is a king, there is a minister who is employed by the king and the queen. There is a chief of police, and there is a character called Dupin, who is a detective. These are the 5 primary characters who figure in Edgar Allan Poe's the Polnoid letter. Now, as the story opens, we understand that the minister is in discussion with the queen in her own apartment, and while they are discussing affairs, thus, the king enters unexpectedly. Now, the minister quickly notices that the queen is becoming very, very nervous in the presence of the king, and she is very anxious that the king should not see a letter that is lying in front of her desk, on the desk. Now, she is clearly capable of concealing the letter or hiding it, because in doing so, she would innovatively draw the king's attention to the letter, the very letter that she does not want the king to see. Now, the minister sees all of this happening, and when the king and the queen are distracted in talk, he swiftly, pockets the letter, and he substitutes a fake letter from his own pocket, which has a similar appearance to that of the letter that he stole from the queen's desk. Now, soon after this, the queen discovers that the letter has been stolen, and she quickly realizes who must be responsible for that theft. She realizes that the minister must have taken the letter. Now, after the minister leaves, she gets the chief of police and his man to search the minister's apartment, thoroughly in an attempt to retrieve the letter. However, in spite of employing his best man and in employing the best people that he has, and in spite of sleeping in his room with extensive and scientific research, they are unable to retrieve the letter. And the queen naturally becomes frustrated. In desperation, the queen asked for Detective Dupin to help her in getting back her letter. Now, Dupin visits the minister's apartment and talks to the minister, and realizes that the minister would not really carry a letter with him on person, because it would be too risky. If he were to be apprehended, arrested, and searched, that would reveal the letter immediately. So he must still have the letter on him in person, yet at the same time he must have kept it, that is, he must have kept the letter in some place where it would have been extremely easy for him to retrieve, because if he is not able to retrieve the letter itself, the very purpose of having the letter is defeated. Therefore, the pen correctly deduces that the letter must be in the minister's house, but it must not be very well hidden, because if it had been extremely well hidden, the inspector would have discovered it in the first place. He correctly deduces that the letter must have been hidden in plain sight. Thus, he goes back to the apartment and finds the letter very casually placed among the other letters that the minister has in his apartment. Now, Dupin steals the letter back, substitute a third fake letter in its place, that is in place of the original letter, and the original letter, of course, is returned to the queen. Now, order is restored, and the minister's plan is spoiled. This, in effect, is a bit of the story that we are interested in. Thus, if you attempt a psychoanalytic Lacanian reading of this story, we understand that the stolen letter becomes an emblem of the unconscious itself. Because in the story, we found out nothing about the contents of the letter. We do not know what the letter contains. However, we do see that the effect that the letter is capable of eliciting character in the plan. It is capable of evoking a strong emotion from almost all the characters within the story. Likewise, by comparison, the content of the unconscious is by definition unknowable. It is unknowable to us, but everything we do is affected by what our unconscious contains. We can all guess at the nature of this content by observing its effects, just as the same way we can reduce the general nature of the letter's content by looking at the anxiety that it generates. Similarly, a Lacanian critic would point out that all letters are thus, all words are thus, like the purloined letters. We can never open them and we can never see the accountants. However, we do have the signifiers, which are the verbal envelopes of the concepts themselves. But this concept, these envelopes, cannot be unsealed. We cannot open them. We cannot get to their contents, so that the signified will always remain hidden. The signified will always slide away from us, just like the content of the purloined letter in Edgar Allan Poe's tale. Therefore, we understand that comparing the Freudian and the Lacanian examples discussed in this lecture will make it immediately apparent that even though they are or they stem from the same original body of Freudian theory and Freudian psychoanalysis, there is an immense gap and there is an immense gulf that is between these two approaches, and that is the very beauty of psychoanalytic criticism, of course. Now, even though it basically stems from the same key concepts, it differs significantly from Freudian analysis to the psychoanalysis developed by Carl Gustav Jung, and eventually to those that are continued to this day by people like Lucan and Christa and other such theories. And this, of course, would conclude our short discussion of short story by Edgar Allan Poe and how it is example of how we can apply psychoanalytical literary criticism. Thank you very much and see you in the next lecture.